If New York is the city that never sleeps, it's largely because of its subway. No other city, not London with its tube, nor Paris with its metro, offers its residents underground transport 24 hours a day, year-round. Coney Island is the depot from which many of the trains pull out. This is the largest such facility in the world, where over 1,000 carriages are stored, scrubbed and serviced before they set out to cover the 230 miles that make up the system. Some have been turned into a rolling art form, at least in the eyes of the graffiti fiends. Many more have been replaced or reconditioned in a major offensive led by the city's transit authority to revitalize their stock. From the moment the first train started running in 1904, New Yorkers have shown an affinity for the clank and clatter of steel wheels on rail, and, despite its many shortcomings, every day over 3.5 million people still travel on the world's most celebrated subway. There are even a few who have traveled the entire length of the system, passing through the 463 stations that serve 4 of New York's 5 boroughs: Queens, Brooklyn, the Bronx, and Manhattan. 3 routes, the Interborough Rapid Transport, or IRT, Brooklyn Manhattan Transit, or BMT, and the IND for Independent, all converge on Manhattan Island, the nerve center of both city and subway. This is the New York known to millions who will never visit it. Below, less than 1 million people live in Manhattan, but every day over 5 million come to work or play there. The vast majority, 85% and rising, are transported by subway. David Gunn was appointed president of the New York City Transit Authority in 1984. His first task was to deal with the problems that had arisen in the mid-70s when the city almost went broke and crime, dirt and deterioration had driven thousands of riders off the subway and onto surface transport systems.
The city of New York cannot function without the subway. And the quality of the subway service has an impact in innumerable areas in this city. And there's no question in my mind that the city suffered as a result of the reputation of the New York City subway system. As the subway system gets back on its feet, begins to function well and do its job in an increasingly effective manner, that redounds to the city's benefit. I mean, this is a city where the subway is part of the ethic and the ethos or the image of the city, the New York City subway system. It mirrors, in a sense, everything that's good and bad about the city. Everybody's down there. It's a very democratic experience because the city forces people to ride the subway. Almost everybody has to ride that subway system at one time or another. And so you see a complete cross-section of this city when you ride the subway system. They're all there. Everybody's down there. It's not only transportation, it's entertainment.
59th Street, the southern border of Central Park, and a frontier of sorts between Midtown and Uptown, between one way of life and another. Midtowners, who own some of the most expensive apartments in the world, meet Uptowners campaigning for basic rent controls. Little more in common than the daily dependence on the subway. The fare's the same for everyone. A $1 token takes you as far as you want to go. The social melting pot of New York never stops boiling. The earlier immigrant communities of European Jews, Italians, Irish, gave way to blacks, Hispanics, and Orientals. To the newcomers, usually poor and confused, the subway was as essential as ever. But even they tried to avoid using it. When a passenger used a gun against muggers, there was applause, but many New Yorkers saw their worst fears realized. Even without Bernard Goetz, the New York press has always ensured that subway travelers were fully aware of the risks they take.
Obviously, What you're dealing with is the perception of that people have of the subway system. I think the subway system is safe. I ride it myself all the time, and I've ridden it every hour of the night and day. And the system statistically is safe. We have problems, but we're moving 5 million people a day in this system, and obviously you're going to have some crime.
If David Gunn were to ride out into Brownsville, East New York, and Brooklyn, through the South Bronx, he'd probably need rubber underwear and a bulletproof vest. He'd have a far different view of the subway system that he feels is getting so much better.
149th Grand Concourse. All right, so make sure you spread out on the cars once we get in.
Curtis Sliwa is self-appointed leader of the Guardian Angels, a group of young vigilantes who strode out of the badlands of the South Bronx and into the city's imagination. The idea came to Sliwa, he claims, while he was a regular passenger on Train 4, the Muggers Express. The authorities regard the Angels with suspicion, although the mayor of New York welcomed their efforts. They have no particular authority. Should they catch anyone committing a crime, they can, like any citizen, detain them until the police arrive. So far as the transit authority is concerned, they are fare-paying passengers like any others.
The further you get away from the core of the city, Manhattan, and you get into the outer boroughs, more isolated the stations, far less police, and even the physical atmosphere is more depressing and more palatable to a wide variety of criminals. Assume that you were the victim of crime. You had just been robbed of your money, or raped, or attacked. Would you have been roaming about many minutes looking for police? Or might you not have just gotten back on the train, gone home, said some prayers, and thanked God that you were still alive? That's what typically happens to many victims. They can't stand around waiting for police. So when you see Guardian Angels in the subway train or on the platform, you feel better because you say, out of all the people who may be here at this point, if I were to be targeted by some criminal, pickpocket, jostler, sexual deviant, I know that these young men in the red berets will risk their life to defend me, even though they may not even know me, may be of different color or a different background. We're just about as close as you can get to those kind of superheroes, those comic book cartoon heroes that exist in real life. And the best thing is they're real people.
The Guardian Angels have since expanded their operations above ground to the more threatening neighborhoods served by the subway. Times Square, crossroads of the city, has lost much of its luster since the 20s and 30s, and today drug dealers of all kinds, particularly those specializing in the debilitating crack, share the sidewalk with bewildered tourists and Broadway theatergoers, all of them trying to dodge the hell-bent cab. This is New York at its most manic, and not surprisingly, the subway stop below has the system's highest crime rate. With 250,000 people passing through its maze of corridors and tunnels every day, it's also the most heavily patrolled. The Transit Police of New York are the 5th largest force in the country, with a jurisdiction that requires specialist training for underground crime fighting.
In 1987, there was about 1,650 homicides in New York City, throughout the entire city. 7 of those homicides occurred on the subway system. The New York City subway system has several contributing factors that lends itself to the perception of crime and fear on the system. First of all, it's underground. There is a natural tendency to be fearful of going under the ground. And now people not only have to deal with that initial fear, but they find themselves in an environment that is less than hospitable. And if they see somebody acting disorderly, or they see somebody evading the fare, jumping over a turnstile, or not paying their fare to get on a train, now they not only find themselves in a hostile environment, but they think that they're there with criminals. The vast majority of the transit police officers on patrol in the system at any given time are uniform officers. They're out there. Their primary purpose is to deter crime, to lend aid to passengers who need it, to make apprehensions of people who are committing crimes or committing minor violations, quality of life type of violations that detract from the environment.
Can you wait on the steps? Can you get up the steps, please? Go sit over there.
Can you get the steps? Blocking the traffic here. It's a dangerous place to sit. Okay?
Every weekend, Grand Central Station is flooded with New Yorkers evacuating town. But deep below the grandeur of its concourse, there are daily dramas. This is Grand Central Tower, one of the subway's busiest control rooms, where high-tech means hands-on. While the system preserves an impressive safety record, traffic control depends on radio contact rather than computer automation, and margins of error are slight indeed.
I have your attention, please, Uptown riders, Uptown 4, 5, and 6 riders. Due to the fire department in the area of 14th Street, we have a delay in Uptown service. Arriving on the Uptown Express track now is the number 6 train. This train is being rerouted to Woodlawn Road. Disregard the signs, this Uptown number 6 being rerouted to Woodlawn and Jerome. We have extensive delays at this time. This number 6 train will be going to Woodlawn and Jerome.
A fire in the old wooden sleepers of the elevated tracks creates a familiar delay for the beleaguered controllers to deal with. At times, it seems this antiquated system is held together by rubber bands and string, a miracle that it works at all. It relies heavily on services like the city fire department. Less than half the $4 billion or so a year the subway needs to operate is raised from fares, and the shortfall must be made up by reluctant tax and road toll payers. There's never enough money to go round. The neglects of the 1970s forced safety to the top of the agenda for the transit authorities. To regain public confidence, their immediate priority has been upgrading maintenance facilities, rolling stock, and tracks. The big cleanup, they call it.
The New York City subway system had fallen on hard times. Basically, the entire physical plant was a wreck. The car fleet was a wreck. It was covered with graffiti. It was dirty. It didn't work well. Had tremendous deferred maintenance. The track was in real serious trouble. And all of the other infrastructure items, pumps, fans, and so forth, were in serious trouble. By rebuilding the system, we've been able to eliminate or drastically reduce the possibility of certain events. For example, a derailment or a fire, a serious fire. But on top of that, what we've done is, particularly with the car fleet, and we're really proud of that, we've gotten the car fleet so that 90% of the car fleet now looks pretty good. It's clean, it's free of graffiti, and of course it's running much better because we've rebuilt. Over half the fleet is either new or rebuilt, and the rest of it will be done in the near future. But the car fleet is almost totally restored from a visual perspective.
If the face of the subway is changing, Midtown Manhattan is forcing the pace, as always. Tiffany's, Trump Tower, Saks Fifth Avenue, Radio City Music Hall. Like the subway, every corner of New York seems as familiar as an old tune. Currently, the city is attracting 20 million visitors a year, most of whom seem to gather at lunchtime on Fifth Avenue. As gridlock spreads to the sidewalk, business executives take to the BMT to make their next appointment. For New Yorkers like author and columnist Jimmy Breslin, the subway is not only a means of avoiding the crowd.
New York is the only place I could live because I happen to be one of the 4 or 5 members of the free world who cannot drive a car. I must live atop a subway or I simply don't move. So I would sit in the back of cars smoking a cigar and giving directions to 1,000 different drivers, wives and relatives, and it drove them crazy. And I love that aspect of it, and then whenever I would get into a traffic jam with them, I'd just get out of the car and say goodbye, and I'd walk downstairs and get on the subway. It comes from Brooklyn all the way through to Manhattan. it takes someone from the crummiest slum in Brooklyn, a mother with kids with no chance to go anywhere, gets on a subway and takes them to the Museum of Natural History on 81st Street and Central Park West, or across the Fifth Avenue to the Museum of Art. Now that sounds like someone talking, yes, the glories of New York. It actually does happen. We have a poor population, it's to our shame forever. At the same time, we probably have the most cultured and smartest poor on the face of the earth because of the subway.
Nothing stays the same in New York. Upper Manhattan is pushing northwards, and Harlem, for years a black ghetto, is now under siege from property investors and gentrifiers. Reluctant tenants are being pushed further out, to the Bronx and beyond, as their brownstones and tenement blocks await a facelift. Residents like Mamie Stone have observed that lower prices are not the only reason the area is attracting so much attention.
This is the only part of town that I can think of, off the top of my head, that has all the subway systems that stop in it. Now, what the train actually does is that it makes it possible for us to connect with the other parts of the city. New York itself, it makes it possible for us to connect with the Bronx. So we use it for work, we use it for play, we use it for interacting with people. Harlem right now is the most sought after real estate property in the world, I say. Right now, the homes that we struggle to hold on to, the places that some of the buildings that we can't afford to buy, to keep, to maintain, to renovate, that are closed, are now being bought up by other people, so that Harlem, that has now become a black Mecca, paradise, or even a place of not really beauty to other people, is now being sought by other people as their future home.
It's perhaps not surprising that the subway is partly responsible for pushing up property prices here. 125th Street is Harlem's main street, where 3 lines cross, served by no less than 10 different trains, among them the A train.
I remember myself as a child on the train, and it only costs a nickel to ride the subway. And we would get at the front end of the A train, and we would watch as the train swerved and curved and would speed down the rails. And that was part of our excitement. That was our entertainment.
Get on board the A train. Take a little ride around the city. Brooklyn, clear up to Harlem. You see, New York is mighty, mighty pretty. Take your baby subway riding. That's where a romance gotta be hiding. Oh, get your plane or airplane. You'll find New York is mighty, mighty pretty. Get aboard the A train.
New York's may not be the world's oldest subway, that's London, nor the busiest, that's Tokyo. But the A train is undoubtedly one of the world's greatest subway rides. 207th Street and Washington Heights, way up on the northern tip of Manhattan, is where the A train starts. Down through Harlem, it trundles on the L tracks before plunging below ground onto the Upper West Side, fringing Central Park, traveling south to take in some of New York's finest sights. Slower trains, which stop at all stations, are known as locals. As an express, the A train stops only at certain stations. Its official name is the 8th Avenue Express. Duke Ellington would have found that harder to put to music. Midtown, its first stop is 59th Street, then on to 42nd Street and Times Square. Expert subway riders know how to switch among the various routes to travel in the shortest possible time. Penn Station is where many will make their connection. Here, passengers can transfer to bus or mainline railway for ongoing journeys, or emerge into Madison Square Garden. Others will wait impatiently for their homeward-bound locals. Much of what is most shocking and exasperating about New York is encapsulated in Penn Station. Night and day, it resembles a kind of Times Square undercover. A refuge, in addition, for the homeless who haunt the public spaces of this great and wealthy metropolis. The city that can move 5 million passengers in its subways and buses every 24 hours seems unable to house its few thousand social inadequates. For the A train, next stop is 14th Street, and then West 4th and Washington Square, marking the invisible line between Midtown and Downtown, and Greenwich Village. This is prime real estate. The small streets taken over by affluent singles and young couples just beginning their climb up the ladder of prosperity. The once dominant Italian atmosphere has been diluted and mixed with other European influences. Old hangouts of writers and painters have to fight to keep their identity or resist being transformed into the next inn, restaurant or gallery, depending on the week or the weather. New Yorkers are nothing if not fickle. Every weekday, the majority of A-train commuters head further south to Chambers Street and the World Trade Center. Peak hour is 8:30, when trains disgorge thousands of office-bound workers into the country's major financial institutions. Wall Street is still its heart, and few American banks or brokers could afford not to have their headquarters nearby. This end of Manhattan Island was the site of the earliest European settlement in the 17th century by Dutch colonists. The landmarks that dominate the city today are the soaring twin towers of the World Trade Center, at 110 stories each, still New York's tallest. The so-called B&T crowd, who use New York's bridges and tunnels to commute, have to face the most horrendous journey into work. Only the subway saves the city from being jammed solid at this time, and the dreaded gridlock. While some subway routes share the Manhattan Bridge with the motor traffic above it, the A train speeds its way under the East River, through to Brooklyn and beyond, via the Fulton-Cranberry Tunnel. Once it leaves Manhattan, it'll still be less than halfway through its daily journey, traveling 35 miles through 36 stations, the world's longest subway ride. For visitors, it's perhaps the cheapest tour in town. For commuters, there's a terrific view of Manhattan twice a day. The Alice train, as the controllers call it, takes an hour and a half from end to end, winding its way through the depths of Brooklyn, pausing at JFK Airport, before finally reaching its destination, Rockaway Beach, on the shores of the Atlantic.
The A train is a great train, the longest train ride for $1 in the world. It starts in a dense city neighborhood and it ends at the shores of the Atlantic Ocean. I mean, where are you going to get a ride like that? People say the rattle, the rumble of the subway, and it sways and it's hot and noxious. To me, a subway line runs on silk. It's smooth, it's wonderful. We're nothing without it.
You'll find New York is mighty, mighty pretty.
There is no city without the subway. As there is no Breslin in New York without the subway, there would be no city of New York without the subway.
Go get your car or airplane. You'll find you take the A train. Yeah. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. We'd like to thank each and every one of you for coming out.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you aboard the ship Sands. How are you all doing today? Great. Okay, let's have lots of energy. Please laugh at my jokes. My name is Vera. So if you have questions during the tour,
Toronto, the largest city in Canada after Montreal, lies on the north shore of Lake Ontario. It was founded by colonial Americans who remained loyal to the British Crown after the American Revolution. With the finest harbor on the Great Lakes, it flourished on shipping and solid investments. Canada's steady economic expansion since the 1950s and its easy access to the United States has turned Toronto into an international commercial center. But between the new skyscrapers, its civic and domestic architecture offer reminders of the colonial past. Peter Ustinov once said that Toronto was what New York would be like if it were run by the Swiss. He may have been thinking of the city's orderly, if relaxed, air, but he could have been referring to the ease with which people escape from the hard-edged surroundings in which they earn a living to the spacious retreats in which they enjoy their life. Out in the leafy suburbs, where for many the day still begins with a farewell wave from an old-fashioned porch, there are plenty of things that the Swiss, or anyone else, might envy about Toronto. High on the list is the well-thought-out interface of roads and public transportation. The passengers being delivered to this subway station will probably be at work before the driver who brought them can get back home on the freeway, before the goodbye kiss grows cold. As regular as its own timetables, the Toronto subway wins awards for the safest, cleanest, smoothest running system on the North American continent. Without it, Toronto would be an entirely different kind of city. Not only do more people use the subway every year, but those who do use it increasingly often. The average passenger now takes 200 trips a year, compared to only 150 in the mid-1960s.
The subway is the critical part of what Toronto is because it was built over about a 20-year period at the same time as the population of the city of Toronto doubled. We have, I think, two overall goals. First of all, it's simply to provide the best transit service that we can within the resources that were provided, which is a complicated business in and of its own. We got to get the people on and off the trains every morning. But the second has been to support a land use plan and to support a development pattern that will make transit work.
Until 1953, the streetcar and the automobile were adequate forms of transport for a place that was still something of a backwater. But at that critical moment in Toronto's growth, the city fathers showed remarkable vision. In partnership with the surrounding communities, they gave the Toronto Transit Commission some stirring orders. $67 million was invested in a heavy-duty, no-frills subway as the backbone of their people-moving plan for the future. Only well outside the central area of Toronto do trains run on the surface. For many of the underground sections, the builders were able to use the cut and cover method, digging a trench for the track and roofing it over afterwards. But where hospitals and other important buildings stood above, they had to tunnel, running the lines through huge tubes to muffle the noise of the trains. There are two subway lines running roughly east-west and north-south. The routes cover 35 miles and carry nearly 500 million passengers every year. The most heavily used part, the beauty of the system for most travelers, is the U-shaped loop of the north-south line that stitches the downtown area together like a thread. During the first 10 years that the subway was in operation, 90% of the new office buildings erected in Toronto were built within a few minutes' walk of the dozen or so downtown stations. Along the length of the line sprang up sub-centers, which are now virtually cities in themselves. From this control room, the trains speeding along are under constant observation. A computer helps supervisors to set routings and check the progress of traffic. The cars are wide and comfortable, even when packed during the morning and evening rush hours. And they and the stations are virtually free of serious crime. Yonge was the first line of the system to be built. Where it intersects the east-west Bloor and Danforth line is the busiest station in town. It's also deeper than those that serve only one line. Both below and above ground, it has become Toronto's principal crossroads. Keeping the conflicting streams of commuters apart is work for experts.
The biggest problem would be the synchronization of the crowds from one line to the other. When there's a minor delay on one line, that causes a backup of trains and therefore a surge in the crowd flow from one line to the other. So you could have on the east-west line a 5-minute delay, then all of a sudden you have a lot of people coming on the north-south line trying to squeeze onto one train. You can only get about 1,000 people on a train. And in rush hour you can have 3,000 or 4,000 people at the station at one time. You notice in the afternoon they're in a hurry to get home more so than they are to get to work. But you get a lot of rush. The rush hours now are lasting longer than they used to as well. There's more and more people out going to work.
Toronto works in ways that many other cities don't. It has a terrific infrastructure. The way the different services relate with each other, whether it's the transit system, the surface transit, the road systems, the computerized efforts that have been made to keep traffic flowing, the citizen activists who've stopped expressways from going into the center of the city, the desire on the part of everyone to keep it working. It's constantly boasting that it's one of the few North American cities with a vibrant set of downtown neighborhoods.
Charlie Pachter may be the Toronto subway's most unexpected fan. He finds it both an inspiration and an opportunity.
At the time, I was looking for work. I had heard a rumor that they were contemplating a mural for one of the stations, and I started to think about the placement in this station of something monumental. And I realized, of course, that hockey is to Canada what wine is to France. So what did I do? I took the two historically most famous rivals in Canadian hockey history, the Montreal Canadiens and the Toronto Maple Leafs. One team was blue and white, the other was red, white, and blue. I wanted to get my work out in a public space, and I'm very mindful of the fact that one image in front of 40,000 people an hour can do more for you than 100 shows around the world. I would probably like to see more stations as events rather than just places that you pass through. For example, given the choice, I would have liked to have done the entire a platform in hockey players. They only gave me 35 feet. That's all I was allowed. But those are the little things that you're up against. You know, when I would have a grandiose scheme, I'd get a phone call from the head of the TTC saying, well, you know, it's not an art gallery, eh? It's a subway station. You know, that sort of practical, and our subway, as you can see, is nothing if not practical and clean and matter of fact.
Cleanliness, matter-of-factness, Toronto virtues. Above ground, Toronto, like most of Canada, is snowbound for much of the year, but the remainder offers an enviable outdoor life. The summer is all the sweeter for being short. For these few weeks, it's hard to imagine the harsh winter ahead. While the sunshine lasts, everyone makes the best of the lakeside. This has always been a city of immigrants. After World War II, Toronto became a cosmopolitan city. A wave of displaced Europeans diluted the original English, Scottish, Irish mix, getting here however they could. Some of the newcomers did pretty well for themselves.
Welcome to Honest Heads and the great, great city of Toronto.
Here in Toronto there's a famous man, but this guy must be insane. His prices are so low, any day he'll be broke. Honest Ed is his name.
Well, I've been in Toronto 65 years now. I was 9 years old when I came here. I don't know if there's any big secret. I had very little formal education. I had no schooling. And almost 50 years ago, when I just getting married, I cashed my wife's insurance policy for $214, and we started a small store in this same location. In fact, there's a sign in the corner window. It says the original store was smaller than this window. And that's how it started. And I think there was never a plan, but it was just an evolvement and a development. And today we have about 400 employees in this store, and it takes away a big part of a block.
The gaudy discount emporium that bears Ed Mirvish's name is not his only interest. He owns one of London's most famous theatres, the Old Vic, and runs it in partnership with the Toronto's Royal Alexandra Theatre, the keystone of the city's own considerable theatrical tradition.
Hello, Jason? How are we fixed? You got the figures all ready? That's good. All right. I think you can make it in many of the great cities of the world, but Toronto is my home, and it has presented opportunities, and I've taken advantage of them. Toronto is a very different city today. I think it was after the Second World War that so many different nationalities started to arrive here, and I think it made Toronto a better city. The different cultures, the mosaic of different people, is what makes Toronto what it is.
Gianmarco Venturi, Pagusta, Uomo Fast, tutti quei disegnatori dall'Italia sono a Jason's Shop for Men.
The Italians were the first wave of arrivals from Europe. Then every nationality sought out its corner. Ukrainians, Hungarians, Greeks. The most recent wave of immigrants comes from Vietnam and Hong Kong, enlarging the earlier Oriental community many times over. Enormous investment from Hong Kong, ready money looking for a safe home before the colony is integrated into China, has accelerated the growth inspired by the subway. The deeper Toronto digs, the higher Toronto soars. No matter how much snow falls on Toronto, how bitter the wind sweeping across the lake, the subway ensures that everyone gets to where they have to go, warm and dry. Inside the downtown loop, marked out by the subway, a vast underground city has come into being. It covers 14 square miles. There are atriums, escalators, restaurants, galleries of shops that any city would be proud to see above ground. Its heart, Eaton Center, occupies 2 city blocks on its own, a subterranean pleasure land where even the weather is forgotten. Banks, office blocks and hotels can all be reached through the basements of the surrounding buildings. 74 entrances altogether. In the 1920s, when the United States, across the water, was in the grip of prohibition, many a shady fortune was made in Toronto from bootlegging. Today, brokers come in on the subway to tend the financial locomotive that powers the city's prosperity. This is now one of North America's top volume exchanges. Gold and other minerals, equities, standard commodities have taken over from the port commerce. Property, too. The lakefront, on which Toronto's earliest fortunes were founded, is now so valuable that more of it must be created by reclaiming land from the water. Everyone in town wants to live there now. The apartments in this building, number 1 Quayside, went on sale for a minimum of $1 million each. Everyone was snapped up within the day. But not everyone was pleased to see that kind of money being paid.
Now, you might be familiar with the term yuppie, young urban professional. Okay, well, this is their heaven. This is where they all live. Harbourfront is now the chic place to live in Toronto. They've all been built within the last 3 years. They're very expensive. First building I'd like to point out to you is Queen's Quay Terminal with the green glass windows. Have any of you visited the terminal building yet today? Yeah, it's really nice. Expensive, too. All my paychecks go into that building, Queen's Quay Terminal. The ones in the far right with the green sloping windows are called King's Landing condominiums. Very beautiful when the sun shines on the windows because it looks like a waterfall reflecting from the building. Now they run anywhere from $500,000 to $3.5 million a piece. A little bit expensive, but with this price, you do get a private mooring area for your yacht.
In pre-subway Toronto, some of the better lakeside views were only to be had from public housing tenement blocks. The area was harder to reach then. There were no moorings for yachts and pleasure boats so close to the business center. But when the Harbourfront Light Railway, a largely surface system integrated with the subway, is finished, stockbrokers and bankers will be able to get from the office to their expensive new condominiums without getting their galoshes wet. Mingling economic groups in this way is something Toronto seems to deal with as deftly as shape is imparted to the rails that will carry the Harbourfront trains around the curves. In many ways, the Light Railway was one of the Transit Commission's more complex projects. Deciding to spend $50 million was merely the beginning. Part of the track lay through a tunnel. The maze of cables and plumbing put down by the clusters of existing skyscrapers had to be avoided, moved, or diverted. Building the tunnel alone ate up half the allotted cost. The completed Harbourfront line permits passengers to connect with mainline trains as well as the subway system proper. That's the way they like to do things in Toronto. Integration of public transport has been the key policy of the Transit Commission from the beginning. Toronto's surface routes have, of course, spread far beyond the subway's reach. They're organized on carefully calculated grid plans, and detours and new destinations added as demand increases. The same one-fare ticket will take a passenger to any stop on the entire system by train, bus, or streetcar in any combination. Those first old streetcars, rounded up in the United States and given a coat of municipal paint, were labeled Red Rockets. Their successors still run, their timetables, like those of the buses, coordinated with the subway. Every streetcar stop has a telephone to tell travelers when the next one will be along. So much a part of the city are the Rockets that the 50th anniversary of the opening of their first line called for a party.
As a matter of fact, a lot of the streetcars that we bought, like today, the birthday party for the Red Rockets over here, were streetcars that we bought from other North American cities, because in those days they were putting in diesel buses and not believing in something of a rapid transit nature such as a streetcar, which was really a forerunner to some extent of a subway. There's no question that you can't have major development in the city without rapid transit, because people in the city believe in using rapid transit. It's not a socio-economic system, unlike some cities in the world where people go because of their economic situation. As I said to you earlier, a president of a bank would be on that subway, or a doctor or a lawyer, whatever profession. You'll be riding the subway just as much as anybody else because it's convenient, it's efficient, and that's the kind of system we want. So that it's very important to any development as to where the transit is going.
Toronto now has twice as many people to move about as it did when the first subway line opened. The planners, by redesigning the city from beneath, have been able to keep pace with such dramatic expansion. And there'll be more to come.
We're going to see in Toronto, I think, a replay of some of the dynamics that happened in the United States 20 or 30 years ago, the conflict between the car and transit. People don't decide to leave their car at home because transit is cheaper. It's always cheaper. But if you can provide service, and this is where the subway comes in, then the investment in service is what works. And this is what's worked in Toronto. Except for the very, very high end of income and people who have 3 or 4 or 5 cars, almost everybody in Toronto uses transit. It's just taken for granted that everybody uses it. It's a community service. We're in the middle of that debate right now. That is, what the decisions taken by Metropolitan Toronto and by the other levels of government over the next 3 or 4 years with respect to that dynamic are going to determine the shape of Metropolitan Toronto for the next 50 years or so.
Those who can afford buy, and those who can't move out to what are now suburban apartment complexes and use the subways to come into work. How is this going to change the city? It's be very interesting to watch the next decade. The temples of money are rising around us everywhere. There's a whole new lifestyle called condominium lifestyle. There's a kind of Manhattanizing of Toronto that's occurring, that every corner of every major street now has buildings with 2 or 3 floors of commercial and sports facilities and athletics and meeting rooms, and then the apartments for the single gentrified downtown consumer. This is a big change. The city is booming, and there are danger signals all around.